right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everybody to our PSEMA call. This is our first member event, so excited to do that and excited to have former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate joining us. For those of you who are new to PSEMA, it is the Private Sector Emergency Management Association. And it was about 2 years ago, this time of the year, that I thought we really needed an association that focused on private sector, managed by private sector, funded by it, and run by it. And so it was started after Hurricane Ida, and really seeing that need of how do we bring everyone together and have a conversation and solve problems beforehand, and then when something happens after. And one of the first people I called was actually Craig and said, look, this is what I'm thinking. And Craig will go into it a little bit, but he was with Florida Emergency Management prior to FEMA, for those of you who may not be aware of that. And he, while in Florida, helped to build out their private sector office. Fast forward, he goes to FEMA. I come in under Brian Kuhn. We continue to build out that office. And then when Craig got to FEMA, then he helped to build out the private sector NBOC there. And so we're just going to talk about what private sector can be doing to support and how we can help with our government partners. And there are a number of government partners here, both state, and I see some FEMA friends on here. And so I want this to be an open conversation. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand. If you aren't comfortable in speaking publicly, then just send me a chat and we'll be happy to ask the questions. But we want it to be a conversation. And so, with that, Craig, I thought I would start, let's, think about like Florida, because you were there 2004 and 2005, obviously, two catastrophic seasons back to back. And that's when I believe a lot of that private sector initiative started. And Florida was definitely one of the first ones to have an ESF function for business and industry. So if we can maybe start with Florida, and then we'll get into what you did at FEMA.
Okay. Well, 2004, as we started that hurricane season, when a storm hit, power goes out. And we found ourselves kind of as a routine where we'd send food, water, ice, tarps down to the area, set up distribution, and get things out to the public. And that model was based upon going all the way back to Hurricane Andrew. We had a few storms, 95, Hurricane Opal stuff, but really we had not seen a lot of activity till the 2004 hurricane season. Started off with Charlie at Cat 4, followed by Francis, Ivan, and then Gene. Very busy year. And as we progressed through the year, we were pushing a lot of commodities. At one point, I can remember our logistics chief, Chuck Hagan, said he's getting complaints because we had so many reefer trucks tied up in Florida operating as portable warehouses, storing ice and stuff between all of the response. And if it had just been 2004, I think we'd have probably reinforced that idea that government was going to do all this stuff, and we we're going to send all these supplies in, and we were going to put all these resources in. But then the next year we end up with several notable hurricanes. Katrina, which, obviously the impacts in the Gulf Coast and New Orleans, we started out with that. It was like the second hurricane that year. We already dealt with Hurricane Dennis, which had hit the Panhandle, and that response was very much a prototypical response from 2004. Send a bunch of stuff in very quickly, make the assumption that government's got to do all this stuff, and we need to get stuff down to the public. Well, as we go through that year, you then get Rita, and then you get the storm Wilma. And Wilma was a bizarre storm in that at one point it was one of the most powerful storms sitting off the Yucatan Peninsula. It is moving from the west to the east and ends up striking Southwest Florida, where you would expect the majority of the impacts to be. And we were, again, using our model of getting a bunch of supplies ready to go, surge them down there. And Wilma didn't play by anybody's rules. It actually did more damage exiting the coast, knocked out power to approximately, a quarter of the population. Again, our model was we just assumed when the power was out, retail was down, and we had to provide all this stuff. And because we had focused on Southwest Florida, we were not as fast getting into Southeast Florida. And it led a lot of comparisons to what people were seeing in Katrina. But honestly, it was nothing like Katrina. We didn't have the fatalities. And mainly what we were dealing with was the perception that if you're going to have all the stuff there, it needed to be there yesterday. And again, I don't think people understood, and those of you that do retail logistics can understand this. We were in many cases not sure 24 hours out where the demand signal would be, but we were having to pick and identify locations, set them up, and have supplies on the ground within 24 hours of the storm passing through. Not even 72, but within the first 24 hours. And the first day was not pretty. The second day was better. By the third day, it was pretty much normalizing. But I work for this governor who has a very dry sense of humor. And so I get a call from Governor Bush. It's like day 3. He's down in South Florida. He's down in Miami. And he was calling me up to check in. But he wanted to tell me he was at one of our points of distribution. And that's where we were handing out all the food, water, and ice. And the National Guard was staffing it. And we had learned a long time ago, we needed to pick locations that were centrally located, had lots of parking, and were accessible to people in cars. Turned out that tended to be where already you saw a lot of big retail establishments. And so Governor Bush is there and he says, Craig, I'm talking to people, they're happy, they're getting their stuff. He says, and you're in the parking lot of an open grocery store, Publix, and they're eating Taco Bell. Now, this is an area with no power. And it was just his observation that you set up in the parking lot of an open grocery store. And what we had not been paying attention to was in early part of the 2004 hurricane season, the power was out. Publix, Winn-Dixie, you name it, they were down. But they also were recognizing that they couldn't afford to be down, and getting back open was key to customer retention. And so they were bringing in generators and setting up tents. And we saw this in the hardware sector. We saw this in the big boxes. And what we weren't paying attention to was they were getting open faster than we could get back in these areas. And so you get to Wilma, you fast forward. And, when Governor Bush said that, I had interns, I said, I need to find out what's open and what's closed. And we did it brute force. They took phone books when you still had phone books. And they started calling all of the big boxes. And when they got done, they only found 5 big boxes in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach that were closed. Everybody was back up on emergency power or had gotten power. And if you looked at the map of where we put our distribution centers and our points of distribution and got stuff out to the public, it was with the highest populations, with the greatest number of power outages, with the most open stores. And if you were looking at where the stores weren't open, it was Pahokee, Okeechobee, Belglaize, the areas where the stores there were IGAs. They didn't have big box stores. They were having to drive 30 to 40 miles with very limited gas to go to one of these points of distribution where the majority of the population was. And we found ourselves in a situation where we're competing with the private sector. So Governor Bush tasked me, he says, we need to get better organized. And I started meeting with the in-state and out-of-state big box. If you remember after Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of talk about just turning logistics over to the private sector. And so I was talking to one of the big boxes, and I was asking, could you do this? And they're going, well, how much are you willing to pay? And I'm like, what do you mean? So look, you need to understand, we don't have that much excess capacity in our system. We lose money. Our margins are very thin. So we don't maintain 1,000 trucks sitting idle. We don't maintain warehouses of stuff just waiting for a disaster. We're moving stuff through our system. And as I kept, the conversation was over and over again, and I started to realize we were asking the wrong question, because we kept approaching retail from the standpoint, what can you do for me? Instead of going, what's basically, they got me around to asking the right question. What can I do to get you open? Because every pharmacy that gets open, every convenience store that gets open, every big box that gets open, every hardware chain that gets open, that's a point of distribution. Because I asked Governor Bush this question, again, being fiscally conservative, I kind of knew the answer, but I wanted to make sure before I bit this. I says, is it important we have commodities and supplies in a community for free or available? And he looked at me like, available. And so what we had to do was really reshift our thinking in Florida, that we were actually competing with the private sector. I remember Lowe's telling me They knew the instant our pod started up because they couldn't sell water and they just give it away. But they had routinely shipped water into the hardware stores with all the other supplies that people could stock up on. But they said, as soon as you guys were up and running, we just gave it away. We couldn't sell it. And the thing that we found was we were in many cases setting up in parking lots of open stores that were up on generators. And again, competing with, you're giving out free stuff versus going in the store. So that was the first thing we came up with. We need to work as a team and not compete. We need to go where the private sector can't get open. And where we need to go are some people call them food deserts, other places you just don't have a presence, where you're going to have to go into these smaller communities and neighborhoods. And then those people that don't have cars, don't drive, and don't have a way to get to that. That's a much smaller population. And that's something that's much more manageable for government. But we needed to know, well, did the big boxes get open? Well, we never really had formal communications. So other than assuming, we didn't know. We didn't have a standardized way. And can you imagine, we deal across the state of Florida with dozens and dozens of retailers in that space. And trying to get from them that information was difficult. Yet, if we wanted to be in a situation where we were meeting the needs in the areas where things weren't open or couldn't get open, we need to have that intel. And so that really was where we started looking at formalizing our relationships in the business sector. Now, to a certain degree, we'd already done this with the Florida Insurance Association, where we had already gone into the issue of providing them with, we call the Florida team, the State Emergency Response Team, with what we call CERT hangers that they could put on their vehicles so they could go into these areas that were closed off to the public to start doing assessments and emergency repairs, particularly on commercial properties. So we started talking to the Florida Retail Federation and going, hey, can we work as a team? Because there's all these issues with government favor one or the other, who gets the information first. And we basically said, hey, if you guys will organize the calls, we'll brief everybody. And as we were asking people this question, what does it take to get you open? We heard a lot. But probably the first thing we heard was curfews and how disrupted they were to logistics. That, they said, we're not having a problem with our trucks that are branded that say, Winn-Dixie or Publix or Albertsons or Walmart or Lowe's or, Target, any of them. Our problem is our employees who are not, we don't have necessarily like a standardized ID, or people that are coming in to work on like the refrigeration unit or fixing the forklift. And so we said, well, we'll work a deal with you just like we did with the Florida insurance. We'll give you the placards and we'll print them. Your website, your secure membership, we'll provide the placards. We'll put the date on there that they're effective. You slide these in your windows and we'll make sure that we brief through the Florida Fire, through the Florida Police Chief, Florida Sheriffs, the National Guard, and all the state law enforcement agencies that if you got that in there, then you're considered an essential worker. They need to be let through. Got in a whole bunch of stuff about local permitting issues, health department issues, you name it. And they didn't have a central place to go to get information. And so they found themselves in many cases getting conflicting information and stuff like that. So the idea was, what came out of 2004 was we wanted to make sure that we could get product into communities in the aftermath of disasters. But we wanted to work with the private sector. If the private sector could get up and running in that area, then we would literally draw a 5-mile radius around there, just kind of an arbitrary distance, and going, okay, that area is covered. Where are the gaps? And it was interesting as you laid out what was open. It turned out if we had used that in Hurricane Wilma, we'd have been down in the Florida Keys. We would have been in the interior counties of Florida, and we would have had very little other than probably working through community groups, distribution in the 3 big counties that were impacted, which would have meant a very different response for us, a much more efficient response, and to a certain degree saves the taxpayer a lot of money that we weren't duplicating what the private sector was doing. So I came away from that and began to really understand. Again, we work with Florida petroleum people, both the retail and the wholesalers. we were working with the banks, ATMs and other things, and what happens when you're dealing with all the power outages. And we had seen a lot of innovation in the private sector of getting things back up, bringing in portable pharmacies, bringing in portable ATMs, cellular companies bringing in charging stations and all that stuff. And we didn't have that focal point. And so that was the beginning of creating the function to work with the private sector. And if you understand how we set up our functions within the EOC, it's part of the team. We just group them by what they do. So we put all the people that do transportation, what we call ESF1, so that no matter what it was, if it was a transportation issue, we had one place. We put all the law enforcement into ESF16 because it turned out, we had a dozen state law enforcement agencies, plus you had the Florida Sheriff's Association and Florida police chiefs. And what we learned all the way back to Hurricane Andrew, when somebody's calling for law enforcement, it could have gone to any of those agencies and they wouldn't have known who else got the call. We could either been duplicating response or nobody showed up because they thought somebody else was handling it. So that was really the idea of these emergency support functions, was grouping like resources together to work as part of the team. And that meant once they created the ESF, it was actually part of the state emergency response team. Now, we did this through a lot of the associations, so that kept the attorneys happy, but it also kept in a level playing field. And as we did that, we got a lot of good feedback, and I took that when I went to FEMA. When I got to FEMA, separation of church and state was easier to solve than working with the private sector. The attorneys were having heart failure because it was always seen as, well, you're giving businesses an unfair advantage. If you work with them. I said, I'm not contracting with them. I'm not giving them a bid. I'm trying to figure out how we can share information. My first test of this was we had an ice storm. There had been a previous ice storm that went through the middle of the U.S., caused a lot of damage. So I had states calling for everything. They wanted everything up front. And this was going to be a multi-state event. And we had really, I think, for the first time, had gotten the ability to share data. And everybody wanting all this information. I said, I don't need all that information. And first of all, second of all, the retailers aren't going to give you. This is a competitive business. Nobody's going to tell you how many pallets they got left on the shelf. So all I need to know is, are you open and with normal business? Are you open with limited, supply or other factors, or are you closed? And as this ice storm was hitting, we started getting our first reports out of several of the big box retailers that were feeding us data. And they were painting a picture much different than, per se, the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel will go find whatever damage is, and then that's everything. We were hearing from a lot of the big boxes, we're open. The roads are treacherous, but we're open. We could get there, and we got power. And as those reports came in, instead of ordering more stuff for the states we're about to hit, we just took the stuff that was already there and just kept moving it with the storm. And we were doing it faster than the state could report back up to us. In fact, one of the states called up and said, hey, why are you moving all our stuff? I said, because you're not going to need it. Well, we haven't done our assessments yet. I said, well, I can tell you, these are all of the stores that are reporting in across your state. And there doesn't seem to be any real gaps here. And if they're up and running, that pretty well tells me I can move to the next state because the storm had already passed. And so that was, my experience. But when I got to FEMA, we didn't have that organized. We had to build that. We had to work through a lot of issues with the attorneys and convince people this wasn't about contracting. It was about working as a team and, being able to go to the private sector and find out what their status was so we wouldn't duplicate what they were already doing, but also a place for national change to tap back into FEMA because not every state was working as well as the private sector. And there was a lot of, confusion sometimes that, why was every state different? I'm like, it's called our Constitution. And that's just, it gives us a resilient government because they're all 50 different ways of doing stuff. But there's some common elements, but we could broker that. And, we were introduced in the private sector to concepts like when the president declares disaster, we have a federal coordinating officer who's working with that state, that we can now have direct access back into a lot of the state organizations and state agencies if there's issues that need to be resolved. So it was really about, to me, about getting faster. How do you get faster into disaster areas? And it was my observation that government-centric problem solving was slowing down. The bigger and more complex the disaster, the slower it got. The illusion was it was fast in small, compact disasters, but these multiple hurricane hits, and as we saw in Katrina, it actually got slower. So I wasn't about like the private sector to answer all my needs. It was about how do I get faster? And if the private sector can get stuff done with a little bit of assistance or just getting out of the way, then I can focus on the things that they're not going to be able to address and get those done faster. So that was the evolution. It wasn't so much radical as just as embracing the idea that the private sector is part of the team, that we can have government and non-government agencies working together. But more importantly, we shouldn't be competing with each other for resources or in the case of government, competing where the private sector can already get things done.
With that, I see Tom came off mute. I think he may have a comment or a question for you.
I do. This is all good stuff. Craig, thanks for being here today with us. I've been on the private sector side for 30 years, down here in Florida for 0405 with Office Depot, then Verizon. I work closely with the state of Florida with their business EOC, which I thought was a great tool, because you got to remember, this has to be a two-way street between public and private sides. We've got resources, you have resources, and we both have needs. I was impressed with the several disasters we went through with Florida, utilizing the BEOC. And I liked it when the federal government started with the NBEOC, but I was on a call recently with them for one of the hurricanes, and I wasn't impressed anymore. My image has been tarnished a bit about the NBEOC, because I think they turned it into more of a government program that business can listen in on versus a business program that can solve some of the problems. What was the evolution there, and what's your thought on the NBEOC?
Well, when I was there, we were still building it. We were getting loaned executives from major chains, banks, and utilities to work and as part of our team. And we felt very strongly that if in our headquarters in what we call our National Response Coordination Center, that we needed to have representatives of the private sector in there, because a lot of the things that the government, again, I think bureaucracies are bureaucracies, we love them or hate them, but they tend to focus around what they have to do while minimizing risk with the least expenditure of resources, because they have so many things they got to do with such a high demand signal. So their tendency is to normalize the process for them, not for the community they're trying to bring in. And I think when we got away from bringing in the loaned executives who could, not just speak for their company, but bring that private sector perspective, it was really, I think, one of the most fascinating. We had a person that came in from, I think it was Duke Energy, or no, it was Dominion Energy. And he taught our staff more about how power restoration really works. And, this whole thing about we're going to prioritize stuff. And he says, that's not really how it works. You start from generation through distribution, and then you can start thinking about what you're going to be able to turn on. But until you get from generation to distribution, there's no sense talking about a priority because there's no power. And those insights are bringing in people from, we had one of our first loan executives from Target. And it was just getting people to understand the depth and resources that they have across the country, but that they had almost all that geared towards a daily consumption, that they were very dialed into just in time, just enough, minimizing waste, and that to deal with disasters, shocks to the system, there were certain things they could do, but it would take them a while to try to build up. So I think it would just really reinforce, if we can just get what you have up and running, that takes a big load off of the rest of the response. And so, I left in 2017. I thought we were moving in the right direction. I thought we had good people working that program. But I've been going through since 2016. We're on our third FEMA Administrator. And I sometimes wonder that, again, I kind of went in there and pushed this, but if the administrators aren't pushing it, there's going to have to be external force, because again, we found that those conversations, the whole idea of this call was not just to talk at the private sector, but we'll also go, what's going on out there? Supply chain issues, transportation issues. We had an anecdotal story that Publix was telling us that they had contracted for water coming out of Texas, coming to Florida. And then we turned around and the state outbid them on it. And then FEMA came in and outbid the state on it. And it turned out we were paying 3 times the amount for that water that Publix had on the original contract, because we kept outbidding each other because everybody says we need more water. So I don't know. Again, I think it's this organization and the ability to get back to FEMA and go, hey, we still want to be part of the team, and we need to have information, and we can give you information, and that it's a two-way exchange. I think sometimes FEMA is, we're talking about the number of disasters, but quite honestly, most of these disasters they've been dealing with have been really managed at state and local level, and they haven't really had the demand signals they've had for something like a Katrina. You got to go back to 17 with Maria and Harvey and those storms to really see the kind of demand signal. So sometimes I'm afraid as agencies are successful doing what they're used to doing, it doesn't stretch them into maintaining these relationships.
So I think you have a really good point. And my frustration, and the reason PSEMA was started, was during Hurricane Ida on an NBOC call, someone asked, was there reciprocity for insurance to go to Louisiana? And the answer was, call the state of Louisiana. I said, well, that's not the answer. I've been in the state. I've dealt with the disaster. They're already overwhelmed. And so creating a place where we can do a call like this in a disaster, and that question gets asked and we find the answer for that person, and then we push it out to everyone. Or I've been really engaged, both FEMA Region 6, because I'm here in Dallas. They've been really engaged with us on these conversations and engaging in the planning side of it, right? Because if you're waiting until there's a disaster and you don't know who you need to call, and also helping them understand that we're business and industry, we're not contractors and consultants. So to your point, when the lawyer said to you, you can't pick one business over another, that's, PSEMA's not looking for that. We're looking for how do we solve a problem and help out in an area, as opposed to always asking to be paid for something. And I think that's this mindset change that we're trying to make within the government. And I'd also say, since you've left, I feel like it's even more splintered, because now not only do you have the FEMA private sector OB3I, plus now you've got a component inside of external affairs at FEMA, and then you've got CISA, who's ESO 14. So I just want them all to come together and figure out who the contacts are, so we're not having 3 different calls to try to figure out, besides state calls, right? So kind of your thoughts on, and maybe kind of how we can help shape that message to say to the federal partners, you guys get together and figure it out, and then come, and then we'll work with all of you. But how do we do that?
Well, that's basically what you got to say is what you want, and how to work for you. And again, it's easier for FEMA to deal with associations than individual companies, because that gives you that separation between, I'm giving one company all the information or all the access to stuff. And I think the other thing is, in the federal government, as you pointed out, Julie, there are so many rules around dealing with contractors and making sure that you're not giving them pre-decisional information or an edge in contracting and bid disputes and everything else. And I think that's the mindset for a lot of what I saw at FEMA, was treating the private sector as contractors versus they're part of the team. And I'm trying to figure out if they can get, the function, again, it's sometimes for folks in this business, it was a hard conversation in the beginning. It's gotten better, but it was a hard conversation to get people to acknowledge that government can't do everything in a disaster. And if we weren't doing it the day before the disaster, what makes you think the day after disaster we're going to be any good at it? So that was the whole thing about, well, why don't you get people that were doing this already that are really good at it back up and running and focus where they cannot or where the gaps are. But that meant that had to be a different approach than the traditional, I'm going to issue a contract.
Yep.
And I'm not saying there aren't situations where we would contract, but quite honestly, that wasn't the whole idea. The whole idea was, if I can get the various commercial sectors and retailers back up and running, that took demand off. We know if you look at any disaster that's a big wind disaster, as soon as the power's on, 90% of the response is over and you're back to what's damaged. If you got retailers coming back up and you can get, those basic services back up, then it's a much easier response for FEMA, because the issue is, well, if it's an issue of cash, we can get people quick assistance, individual assistance. We can get them the money. It's much more efficient for the federal taxpayer for FEMA to provide money to people who didn't have insurance to go buy goods and services than to provide those goods and services through a government program that didn't exist or standing the day before in that community and has to be created from scratch. And so again, when I talk about speeding up, it's if it's something that we can turn on that's back in that community, and the issue is people don't have money, well, that's something FEMA can solve without having to send in supplies.
Yeah, and I think it's to your point. Well, and I think most people on here heard the Waffle House Index, which is credited to you, and being able to understand when those businesses can reopen, the communities come back. It's, the economic drivers, right? We, as a PSEMA group, focus too on small business because that's a big component. For instance, though, also to your point, like some of the places you had to put pods during Wilma, it's because they didn't have the big grocery store chain. So how do we work with the Dollar Generals or Dollar Trees, Family Trees, that the convenience stores, right? Because that may be the grocery store chain or provider in those communities. And so we're trying to figure out how we can enable our members and expand our membership to also think how to solve problems. During Hurricane Ian, it was a really interesting conversation. Our first one, we had like AutoZone and TJ Maxx, Dick's Sporting Good. And I'm like, hold on, wait, what's your role? And they're like, but we're essential. AutoZone, people need to be able to repair their cars, or Dick's Sporting Goods sells waiters if somebody needs to get back in. And so I think it's also changing the mindset of how government thinks about private entities coming in and the roles they play. It's no longer just the Home Depots and the Targets and the Walmarts that need to get back in.
Yeah, I did some work for the Convenience Store Association, and they have an interesting factoid. 80% of gasoline you buy is bought at a convenience store. And as they like to say, they are the last mile. They are the closest to any neighborhood based upon their numbers. And so this, again, goes back to, I think, I was down in a county that I do some work for the college down at Indian River State College. And I was talking to the counties, and they were talking about their logistical stuff. And I'm like, do you guys understand how the supply chains work? And they were, well, we know we got to get all this stuff. And I was like, well, do you understand why ice is never an issue in hurricanes? And water always takes 3 days to get caught up. And they're going, no, why? I says, because bottled water manufacturers, Nestle doesn't bottle any more water than they expect to ship the very next day. When you have a big surge for a storm, they can surge, but they got to get in more caps, more bottles, and run extra shifts and pay overtime. That takes them a couple of days to ramp up, and they'll do a little bit before a storm or as soon as orders are placed. But ice is something that is not a steady state. It's built for big events. There was an ice plant we worked with out of Jacksonville. They provided, ice for the Gator Bowl, the Jaguar games. They had the ability to do huge production on weekends, and very rarely get near that during the day on weekdays unless there's a holiday. So they had tremendous surge capacity almost from the get-go, where the bottled water factor, it took them, if they had heads up, they could get there. And I said, the most interesting thing that we found that at FEMA we didn't need to stockpile was baby formula and baby supplies. Somebody says, why? And I'm like, because I was really big about making sure we had stuff in there for infants and children. And when I talk to the major chains, they say, we don't need to stockpile that because guess what? You don't have a surge of babies the day after a hurricane. You may 9 months later, but the day after, there's still as many babies there was before. And so it's not about we're having a huge demand signal for a product that wasn't being consumed at that rate, like maybe bottled water or shelf-stable meals. It's being consumed at a steady rate. You're just really needing to get it back in there down to where it's being consumed. Diesel fuel. I was explaining to them in Florida, we get it 3 ports and that's it. And, what's the difference between a firm contract and a spot contract? And somebody said, well, the spot contract's cheaper. I said, you know why it's cheaper? Because when you deal with any crisis, the spot contracts are not honored. The firm contracts are, and they get the fuel first. And so what does government do? They do low bid. We ran into this problem in 2005. We had school districts calling us up when Katrina hit because the pipelines were damaged and fuel was getting short. And we had school districts calling us up that were running out of fuel and we're not going to be able to take kids to school. And I worked for Governor Bush, the education governor. That did not go over well. And it turned out they had spot contracts because it was cheaper to buy on the spot market than have a firm contract. And we literally had schools go out of almost not be able to go to school because they didn't understand the supply chains. They didn't understand demand signals. They didn't understand, what's the surge capacity and, how long it takes to get stuff moving and stuff like that. And that again goes back to trying to build those supply chains outside of the existing structures is cost prohibitive, slow, inefficient. And I go, why aren't we going back to the private sector and going, what do you need to get open? What do you need to get stuff in here? How do we make your job, basically, I just asked, what do I need to do to get you back in business?
The big frustration is when you hear that FEMA is bringing in truckloads of supplies or water from a neighboring state and not contacting necessarily those suppliers that are sitting in their state. I'm going to just use Texas. HEB is, there's a video out after Harvey that says Texas has HEB and America has FEMA. And it really, now that I've moved back to Texas, I see that, right? And so, how do we're having those conversations here in Region 6 to say, hey, why don't you contact your suppliers, your retailers in the state before you bring it in from out of state and you're clogging up highways and way stations and all the other, potential stuff out there. And so how do we open up those kind of conversations and help our partners, our federal partners, even our state partners understand, to your point, private sector can do a lot, but they've got to be able to, work with us on ahead of time, right? You can't wait till it's broken. You got to fix it before you need it, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I think part of this is I like the HEB is, FEMA's for the rest of us, except NIM's going to send a bill to FEMA to pay for it. So FEMA still pays. So I realize the Texas Republic wants to be independent until they want somebody else to pay for it. Well, part of, we ran at FEMA was time. If I wait for the information, it's too late. So pre-staging and moving stuff is a course of action that FEMA is going to do. I think it really comes back to is the states need to do a better job of knowing what their state capabilities are. I mean, I got to the point at Florida where I didn't want FEMA sending me anything. I wanted to do it myself. I found out that they were just contracting with, many cases, the same vendors we could contract with. And, I don't know if you guys know this, but FEMA doesn't really do the contracting. They do it through the Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps of Engineers has a markup for their cost of administering those contracts. So when you're ordering water, you've got several markups that were taking place. And the way the cost share works is we're on the hook for 25% of that request, 75% federal. And I mean, when I got started in this business, I worked for a great director, Joe Myers, and every disaster they ordered ice. And I just assumed FEMA had an ice maker. So I found out they were again contracting with a major ice maker that was in Jacksonville. And I'm like, well, why aren't we doing that? Well, because we'd have to pay for it up front and then get reimbursed. I'm like, yeah, but it's costing us more money to go through them. And in many cases, FEMA's having to order a lot more than we're going to need because they're having to estimate a much bigger, area. And we got better information. Why are we not doing a contract? And so we had built a warehouse in Orlando. We were focusing on those things that we knew that the supply chain would have difficulty. So we got out of the ice business entirely, said ice is nice, but most people don't die because of lack of it. It's a convenience issue. And we let the private sector handle that. We focused on bottled water, shelf-stable meals, tarps, and other things that when you get big surges, it takes a while to get those supply chains up. And then we spent a lot of time talking to the retailers and trying to figure out as we were coming into the storm, how quickly we could get reports back, what was open. And we'd use FEMA as a backstop. But I got to the point where all I really wanted FEMA for the state of Florida was writing checks. And there were several other states that had very similar experiences that we were fortunate that we had logistical staff. We had experience. And again, there's nothing magical about FEMA sending all that stuff in. They got distribution warehouses. Well, Florida had distribution warehouses. One time, North Carolina had distribution warehouses. You know, we had the ability to do a lot of that because we were getting hit so frequently. It just made more sense. But yeah, I learned early on there's no ice maker at FEMA. They're doing what we would do, just issue another contract, and they do it through the Corps of Engineers.
Tom?
Julie, let me ask you, Craig, how do we do this on a nationwide basis? How do we make the private sector a bigger part of the response and recovery and have FEMA pay the bill? You know, private sector can't give everything away, but maybe we give some attractive pricing when it comes to disasters. So how do we make this model fit everybody, every state?
Well, again, it comes back to the minute you start wanting FEMA to reimburse you for stuff, that's a whole new ballgame. My first premise was we're not exchanging money, we're exchanging coordination.
Right.
I don't want to have to pay a big box retailer to hand water out. I want them to sell it. And then if there are people who can't afford water, then I want to work through the community groups to get it down to that level. But the majority of people can afford to go get their own supplies. They may not like it, they're going to complain about it. And if they don't have insurance, they can apply for FEMA assistance. And FEMA is pretty good. I mean, people say FEMA's slow. I'm like, well, slow is relative. We put $1 billion on the street with Superstorm Sandy and the people's checking accounts in the first 32 days. We did $1 billion in Louisiana in 2016 during the floods in 30 days. So if cash is the problem, you know, we have our volunteer organizations that are doing the immediate things, Salvation Army, Southern Baptist stuff. But by about the time you get the second week and everybody's up and running, and it's now we don't have money to go buy groceries, don't have money to go get water, FEMA's kicking in. By that point, it's not uncommon we have checks going or we have money in accounts a couple of days into that event. So I always get very cautious when people say, well, why can't we get the federal government to pay us to do what we were going to do anyway, unless they want you to do something more? And I'm like, at this point in the conversation, I'm just happy if I can get as much of the critical lifelines in the community, the retail, the gas, the power, telecos, if I can get that stuff back up and running, meaning you're able to do that, and I can focus on the the areas where that isn't taking place fast enough, and just not compete. And in some cases, try to get as much as the regulations. Again, I had this joke. President Obama walks in and says, I want to cut the red tape. I had, Governor Bush come in the DOC, said, I want to cut the red tape. And when they both walked out the door, I said, and neither one of them said we're suspending the law. So there's a lot of nuance that people say, well, we just waive everything. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. There are certain things you're not going to waive. I mean, I dealt with a lot of Jones Act waivers that people were screaming and hollering about Jones Act waivers, and they were all mad and hot and bothered. And those went to the Secretary of Homeland Security because that wasn't FEMA, it was Coast Guard and DHS. And people, again, one of them running for office, Governor Christie, screaming about the Jones Act. And I'm like, well, Congress passed this law, and so far they've not been inclined to waive it. And the Secretary has very specific issues that they have to review. And it turns out most of the requests for Jones Act waivers were economic, not life-saving. So that's why I get to remind people, we'll cut red tape. You can't break the law. There's a difference. An example of cutting red tape in Florida is when we get hit, we, particularly in the summertime, have a lot of what we call boutique blends of fuels, particularly for urban areas. And we routinely, and EPA routinely grants a waiver. So we can use all of the fuel coming in without the special blends, and we're not penalized for increasing ozone and other atmospheric pollution. They give us the waiver. They give us waiver on generation. We get FCC waivers, so stations that are not impacted can boost power and redirect signal in the areas that they're not serving. So we have a track record. We routinely, and again, it's usually efficient, but sometimes we have breakdowns. of getting overweight and oversized vehicle waivers across multiple state lines to bring generators and other large commodity items from other parts of the country, and again, get higher utilization of the vehicles. We routinely waive this between Georgia and Florida for propane trucks, and we waived ours. So we can work those systems. What we can't do is break the law or allow unsafe conditions to occur because we're waiving safety waivers.
So we had a question come in from Tracy. She was asking, what methods did you use or have you learned of on how to engage the private sector, getting the word out? So if you're, a government partner, some thoughts on how they should be engaging outside of becoming a PSEMA member, that we are striving to build out those relationships, but any thoughts on that?
Well, we did it brute force. I picked up the phone and called. By 2005, we were not having direct conversations until after Wilma. So I picked up my phone and I called Walmart. I picked up my phone, and just when Jason was there, I called, Target. I called Albertson. I called Publix. I got an earful from Publix. But again, it was like understanding what they needed. And again, I think this is the thing that we always miss. Everybody wants to say, well, you should do this or you should do that. And I'm like, am I adding value? If I'm not adding value, I'm just another association. I mean, I can tell you, we had more memorandums of understanding at FEMA signed with organizations that, other than the photo op, that was as far as it went. So the thing that I found, if you want me to play with you and you want to play with me, there's got to be a mutual benefit. And in this case, something besides a financial transaction. So it's how do you get them to pay attention? It's like, what can we do to make FEMA's job easier? And then turn around to FEMA and go, here's how you can help us make your job easier. Because where FEMA's going to get clobbered is not directly their responsibility, but they're the ones that are going to catch flack for it if a state falls on its face and can't get supplies into their communities. Whether or not FEMA had anything to do with that, FEMA's going to get blamed for it. We're going to get yelled at. That's why FEMA tends to be very heavy-handed in the initial response to make sure they don't run into the risk of a state underestimating the impacts or not getting ready and not understanding if they've got a good, strong private sector partnership. I don't even like the term partnership. I'm like, if you're not, partnership sounds like you can walk away from this. I'm like, I want you on the team. The only way you're getting out of here is a divorce, and it's going to be very painful.
I like that. Yeah, it's true.
I don't see people grasping that. And the problem is that most governments cannot distinguish between emergencies and disasters. And they think their emergencies will scale up. And what I try to tell people is you got to understand the mismatch between what you're prepared to do and what needs to happen. And the quicker you recognize that, the better you're able to start doing what you need to do differently. And this is a hard thing for government. The private sector is not normally day-to-day integral to their response to emergencies. And I'm counting small floods and tornadoes and windstorms that are not catastrophic. And it self-reinforces what I call government-centric problem solving. And when they get to events that are so big that they now realize, oh crap, what do we do? That's too late. And that's why I want the private sector to be there on these emergencies. So when they scale up, the team's built. And we're building it for the really bad events, not just the day-to-day stuff. And that means that government's got to see the value of because they're going to say it takes time, that it's an effort, and it's another thing they've got to do. So the private sector's got to be able to say, hey, I can help you in these areas. I can get you information. I can tell you what's going on faster than your own response can. And then, because if you come in, the first thing I found is if you come in and says, I need you to do this for me. And I'm like, I'm busy. I can do this for you. I can help you get better. I can be faster. I can get you better information. I can help you address these concerns you have. And then I can go and I can do that if you do this. But
well, and that's I commend, like I said earlier, I have a good, Leah with Region 6 is on here. I have a good working relationship with the Region 6 team overall. Tony understands the role of private sector and business, and we're having these conversations. We've been invited to a conversation tomorrow about the situation in Louisiana with the inundation or the saltwater intrusion. And so it is helping our government partners understand, have these conversations, engage us now in exercises, even if it's just to sit and listen and be able to contribute. I'll also commend Louisiana has reached out to PSEMA and has requested that when they have a big activation, we have a person sitting in the EOC with them. They have their private sector be it business EOC, but we would be sitting there with the logistics team to help think through if something comes up and how to strategize. And so governments are seeing that, and I keep pushing FEMA to help do that. Just a couple of really kind of quick thoughts on, there have been a number, I think it actually happened when you were still the administrator, stepping into the Flint water crisis, which is not a traditional Stafford Act. We are now seeing more of those. Kind of what are your thoughts on, FEMA and getting into all of these other missions that are not necessarily what it was created for?
Well, it goes back to the Homeland Security Act, or what most people call the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. It doesn't speak to the Stafford Act. It doesn't speak to natural hazards. It speaks to being a crisis management agency at the direction of the president or at the request of any of the cabinet agencies to support their operations. So the first thing is, most people try to define FEMA by how you pay for disasters. That's actually the Stafford Act. So when we did Flint, Michigan, we did it under emergency declaration under the Stafford Act, but it was a very limited scope to meeting the emergency needs under the emergency of potable water. We didn't deal with public health aspects. We didn't deal with the long-term cleanup solution. We just dealt with the immediate potable water under the authorities of the Stafford Act for emergency. That's not the first time we've done that. We've done this in other chemical emergencies where we had contaminated water systems. Flint just happened to go longer and end up with people getting, lawsuits. But it was, FEMA's mission was something that they've done at other events. In some cases, there was responsible parties who ended up paying. In other cases, it was the government because there wasn't a responsible party. So everybody's worried about FEMA's mission creep. I'm like, it ain't mission creep. It's crisis management, crisis response. It's what's the cause and effect. And what that usually comes back down to is who's paying. So in some instances, FEMA's provided a lot of assistance and there's a responsible party at the end of the day, they get the bill. Again, I think everybody says, well, FEMA's got, they're overloaded to dealing with too many disasters. I'm like, they're dealing with too much recovery. The response is not where it's the deal breaker. Most response is measured in weeks. It's the recovery that's measured in some cases decades that are eating up the bandwidth.
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes. I'll open up, see if anybody has any questions or thoughts. Tom, anybody else? You're welcome to come off mute.
I'll just make one comment real quick for Craig. Craig, I see that we've done, we don't do a good job when we do disaster assessments. What's the scope of the impact? And I definitely see us needing to do that more because everything is running thin. Money's running thin, resources, people, things like that. Any thoughts on that or how we can maybe do that better? I know we need time and no, for the private sector, companies don't have time. They say, tell me what's happening now. And I turn around and say, well, it's going to take me 8 hours to get there and then plus time to do the assessment. I can't tell you for half a day. What tools can we be looking at then to look at that satellite imagery or some other federal information out there?
Well, I took what I call the brute force approach that by the time I had the information that changed the outcome, I lost time. Time's my most precious commodity in disaster response. So I just came up with a very short thing. Think big, go fast, be smart about it. And again, I'm addressing this to FEMA, and it's a big bureaucracy, a lot of moving pieces. And sometimes you got to be very blunt. I said, think big. We respond to people, not stuff. So tell me the population of the area impact. That's my big number. Go big. Start moving resources based upon the impacts because we're not nimble, fast, or right there. Quit having meetings. So
good.
quit debating, because what would happen is they would pause to wait for more information and they'd lose the window to change the outcome. So I said, go fast. No meetings. Once you decided the impact's there, the population is being impacted, what they're going to need, send it. And then be smart about it. As information comes in, adjust downward. But I think, Tom, one of the things I'm seeing, because I'm doing this, I sit on a board of major utility, is everybody's in the drones and satellites and crap like that. That's still 24 hours before somebody sees it, assesses it, and finds out what's going on. What we're finding in utility space is we're putting sensors and automating almost everything, and we can tell in real time what's going on. I think that data collection has gotten much more powerful. Again, when we were dealing with this ice storm, it was simply that the stores were able through their IT systems to tell what their system did. I mean, everybody kids me about the Waffle House index. Waffle House has the ability, they have cameras at every store. Mm-hmm. So they can actually go, is our camera on or off? If it's on, what are we seeing? They don't even have to talk to the store manager. They're getting all that in their headquarters. So I think and the other thing is we don't need a lot of information. I mean, people gather reams of information. In many cases, it's binary. Are you open or closed? Is the building there or is the building not there? Is the tower transmitting or the tower dark? And then I can fill in what I need to do. So I think there's a combination of stuff, but until you have that fidelity of real-time information in an area that's being impacted, I'd use the blunt force. And again, we saw in California wildfires where a lot of the sensor networks were running over the cell systems. And I remember talking to the state director and said, in the Napa fires, we lost 200 cell sites. So we ended up with big data holes. So I think there is, as people say, we need this, we need that. I'm like, for government, we got to get to a very low tipping point to act because we're too slow and we're too reactive. And it takes us too long to get to that point to recognize what we were doing isn't going to work and we need to change. And in the absence of information, the traditional answer is, I need more assessments. That's time you never get back.
Right. Thank you.
Persia, I see you had your hand up. You got a question or thought?
Hey, Craig, it's great to see you. I've just got a general question. Thanks for all you've done, certainly, and what you continue to do and being an inspiration. So listening to all your comments, would you call this more of a cultural and traditional kind of a wedge that we have in government? Because we're all looking at this situation. There's a lot of great solutions. We can pull out a few stops and, as an action-oriented person, I always wonder why we can't do that. But I want you to comment on what can we do this season? Like, what is the immediate action that we can take, not only for PSEMA and its members, but what immediate action can the states take to try to smooth the way, to try to make the connection? Because it seems to me that there's a gap. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge gaps. I think it's because government tends to build, and this is something that's true in bureaucracies, and you got it as well as the private sector. You tend to build very tightly coupled systems to give you the best results with the least amount of risk and cost. And then you do that program by program, and it tends not to want anything from the outside to be part of that because that's an uncontrolled event. So yeah, there's strong cultural biases for not doing that. I think the thing that I would do is, one is make sure you know who all the state business leads are, whether they have a formal business EOC or they have a person appointed or they have somebody that this is their third order duty. But you need to know, and I would focus not on FEMA this go around. You don't have enough time. The rest of this hurricane season, we're going into an El Nino, so I expect lots of significant weather for U.S. that hadn't seen it in several years with La Nina, is making the points of contact and know in each state what's the point. Is it somebody running an emergency support function? Is it a state business emergency operations center? Is it a logistics person that this is one of the things they're supposed to be doing? But I would make sure that in all of the states and territories, you know who in that state on the emergency management team is your entry. And again, a lot of states in the Southeast, this is pretty straightforward. But we also know states that haven't had big disasters, haven't built these relationships, don't have, this isn't really one of their pressing issues until it becomes their pressing issue. And then it's too late. So I think doing that first thing is just the outreach of going, do I have all the contacts? Do I know what they use? Do they have a formal business partnership in their emergency management team? Is it an ad hoc system, or is this something they're still not yet developed? And Julie knows from being both at state and at FEMA, there's a wide range among states where they're at. Some states like Texas, very well built out. Other states, they really don't have this relationship.
Yeah, I was just, as we wrap up, you were talking about government and asking for more information and having meetings after meetings, and everyone laughed because last year with Hurricane Ian, you know, we get on, the first thing I said on the calls is, this is not your typical government disaster call. I don't have a political boss I report to, so it's not, I'm doing all these things, let's pat each other on the back. It's, let's figure out the problems. And then ironically, some of the problems we solved, when I mentioned it to some of my former bosses, they said, well, they could have just called the state EOC to get that. And I said, but the point is that we didn't have to, right? We are solving these problems. I knew the Florida Petroleum Association, we were able to get an answer. And so that's really what PSEMA is focused on. And I thank you for taking this time with all of us and this discussion. I know we could all stay for a lot longer and be respectful of everyone's time. We're hoping to have a kickoff event in early 24. So I'll reach out to you if you're able to join us to have these kind of discussions, but with a much broader group of our members too. So with that, I'm going to ask any last thoughts or questions, and Craig, or if you have anything that you want to say as a wrap up, and then we'll be wrapping up. All right. Any final thoughts? Oh, Tom.
No, Yanaki had his hand up there. Or
He was just clapping.
oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yep.
The last thing you said, Julie, I think this is something you want to take back to the states and going, hey, look, we can help take some of this coordination load off of you. I think that's the other thing. Again, think about things that you can do for states. If it's you running down, you know, issues with the Petroleum Council so that the state's not having to do that, but you can get the information that somebody on your association needs, allows them to keep working. That's, again, it's all about, I'm very much aware that there's this tendency to go in and think the Fed's got deep pockets and we start thinking money. You do not want this to be, in the beginning, a financial transaction of we got to pay to do this. You want it to be, what can we do to support the states? And it was kind of the approach I took when I was talking to Publix and others. What do you need for me to get open, being the state? And that turned out to be a much more fruitful conversation than I was having when I was going in the beginning, going, hey, can you do logistics for me? It turned out, wrong question. The question is, if I can get Publix open, if I can get Walmart open, I can get, you know, I guess Aldi's buying out Winn-Dixie, a bunch of stores. But if I can get those stores open, I can get the CVS and Walgreens on both sides of the street open at the same time so they don't war each other. You know, Tom, if I can get telecos back up and people have communications and they get internet, those are things that take the demand off the federal government to now we can focus on the physical destructed areas, not spread out among all the impacted population. So again, always go from it. The first conversation is, how can we make your job more successful? How can we make you faster? What are the things you need to be making better decisions that we as an association can provide? And then go, and to do that, you could help us with a lot of these issues we're dealing, particularly with local governments and others, that as a state, you can help us navigate better.
That's one thing, PSEMA, we always say too, is we want to try to solve as many problems from the private sector as we can so that government can focus on the catastrophic events and those communities that don't have the resources, you know. And so if wherever we can help, that's what we want to do. So I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, Craig. Really appreciate your time. Have a safe trip.
Great. Thank you, Greg.
All right. All right. See everyone soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.